we've taken a look at how some of the largest and most successful companies of the world think about their business models. Some that step in and disrupt existing businesses with a new business and business model like IKEA has done. Others, like IBM or Nestle with its Nespresso product, that have existing products and dramatically evolve not just the products and services, but also the processes and the business models associated with them to continue to grow and to generate revenues and value for their customers, but also for themselves and their shareholders. So one would think that global enterprises, that large companies, would invest heavily in innovation across all three of those areas, right? Products, processes, and business models. But it turns out that's not really the case. Studies have shown that large enterprises spend, on average, about 10% of their innovation budget on evolving their business models. And we're going to talk about why that is. They spend 90% of their innovation budgets on products, services, and process. Now, who do we think is spending a lot of money or a lot of effort on new business models? It's all the startups, and it's many of the startups that we see here in the San Francisco Bay Area and Silicon Valley that are looking to fundamentally disrupt existing businesses. More on them in just a minute. Before we leave this topic, I want to quickly go through several examples about businesses that were just too attached, too committed to their existing business models, and they paid the ultimate price. The four companies that I'd like to do some quick case studies around are Eastman Kodak Company, Blockbuster Video, BlackBerry, and Encyclopedia Britannica. Now, I know not all of these are fully dead yet, but if they're not fully dead yet, they're mostly on their way. So let's look at Kodak. Eastman Kodak was one of the most highly regarded and profitable, consistently profitable companies in the world for years and years. They sold relatively inexpensive cameras and lots of film, paper, and chemicals to print out all those photos. And then digital photography came along. In fact, Eastman Kodak created some of the first digital cameras and owned the most powerful early patents on digital photography. Did they take advantage of that? No, they didn't. Why? Because they were so committed to this phenomenally profitable business model that they had. Who's come along and now is starting to take advantage of the digital photography arena? Companies like GoPro. And we'll see as that continues to evolve whether GoPro is fundamentally sustainable. They make money on their hardware, and now they're monetizing their content, the videos that their users take. Let's look at the next one, Blockbuster Video. A very large, popular, in fact, the largest U.S. chain of video rental stores, starting out with video cassettes and then moving on to DVDs. What happened to Blockbuster Video? Well, we all knew that on-demand video was going to happen, as did Blockbuster, but Blockbuster was dramatically overtaken by Netflix. Now, Netflix was actually in a similar business as Blockbuster. They didn't have the bricks and mortar retail chain, but Netflix started out as DVDs by mail. And then as they were able to build an online, on-demand, what they call over-the-top, OTT service directly from Netflix to customers, that became a bigger and bigger part of their business. Number 3, BlackBerry. I loved BlackBerry as a user. For me, it had a great form factor, gave me more screen and a wonderful keyboard, and was a wonderful transition into that mobile web using my smartphone for email at the time as that was coming out. But BlackBerry got stuck there. And as others continued to evolve their smartphone products like Apple, and not just create new products, but also new business models with e-commerce and apps and others, BlackBerry got left behind and was quickly relegated to a largely irrelevant player from being one of the most innovative and highly regarded companies in the telecommunications sector. And finally, we have Encyclopedia Britannica. Now, many of these companies fell prey to one particular set of circumstances, and that set of circumstances was the movement from analog products to digital products, and Encyclopedia Britannica was much the same. Encyclopedia Britannica has largely been replaced by Wikipedia. And it's not just the fact that no longer do we have books that grow old and the information grows stale, but it's the business model as well. Because Encyclopedia Britannica had writers and researchers all over, whereas Wikipedia is populated by users who manage much of that themselves. So they crowdsource that information. Fundamentally different business model, fundamentally different products and processes. So the question is, why is it often so difficult for incumbents to solve their business model problems or to evolve their business models? And I'm going to give you 5 reasons why. 1, incumbents are really invested in the status quo. Like Kodak, in many cases, they created the status quo and are very invested in it. Number 2, their customers and channels and partners are similarly invested in that status quo. Think of Kodak and all of the distributors and the photography development stores and others that said, look, if we move away from this, what comes next? So their partners are also invested. Number 3, it's difficult for those incumbents to really think outside the box, to think outside of their industry logic. Sociologists call this orthodoxies. This is the way we've always done it, and incumbents fall prey to that all the time. Number 4, think about the process that large companies go through every year to go through their strategic planning and budgeting every year. And is that process a nonlinear, let's blow our company up and come up with something new? No. In most cases, it's highly linear. We look at what you did last year and the year before, and we're going to grow by, pick the percent, 5%, 8%. Maybe it's 20%. It's predictable from the inside, and it's easier to manage growth, and it also aligns with what investors look for, which is predictable growth and more predictable revenue streams. Finally, most incumbents, most everybody until recently, has lacked the right tools and frameworks to really rethink their business models. We're going to get to that in one of the later sections. Now, I do want to give an example of somebody who is willing to blow their business model up. Google, in the span of 20 years, has created one of the most profitable, if not the most profitable business in the history of mankind. What do they think about the durability of their business model? Here's a company that has created this amazing mechanism, an algorithm to generate cash that's user created. But Google realizes that as profitable and powerful as that business model is today, 20 years from now, there's a good chance, not a certainty, but there's a good chance that it will not be nearly so dominant. So what did they do? Well, Google in 2015 announced Alphabet. And Alphabet really addressed a major issue for Google, which is how do we manage our current business, our Google search and Gmail and AdWords business, which is so profitable, while continuing to explore new businesses with Google X and Google Ventures and the Hardware and Nest division and others. And Google has said, we're going to run these businesses differently, but we are going to look to disrupt both our own Google business and we're going to look to disrupt other businesses as well. As we know, self-driving cars, medical devices, space exploration, global internet access, and all these things that Google is working on. Now, look at your business. This is the last slide of this section. And think about businesses that you may be in or that you track. Here are just a few of the ventures who have come up with new products, but perhaps more importantly have come up with fundamentally different models to disrupt and blow up those businesses. Airbnb, the rental lodging hotel business. Bitcoin, currency, global currency. Uber, transportation. Spotify, offering so much music for free, all the music in the world, and then we have a freemium or a paid subscription. Dropbox, how we manage information. Amazon, buying just about everything, but even more than that, all the web services that Amazon enables underneath that, leveraging what they've learned. Even something as basic as the razors and razor blades in the Dollar Shave Club, a subscription service for shaving. And then finally we have Tesla. And it's not just that Tesla is innovating around products with their amazing electric cars, but they're also changing the way that those services are delivered because, at least in the United States, almost all car services are delivered by dealers, independent dealers. And Tesla is upsetting that industry by delivering vehicles directly and servicing them directly. They're also doing other things in manufacturing that are fundamentally different from a process standpoint. So these are just some of the ways that business models are being disrupted now. Here's the beginning of section 2, where we take a look at a number of frameworks and tools around business models. In this section, we'll take a look at 3 different ways, 3 different methodologies and frameworks that we can use to really evaluate business models and their different components, test them, and innovate with them. The first one is the business model canvas, which may be the most well-known of any of these 3. And it was developed by Alexander Osterwalder. And we're going to come back to that in our next section, section 3, when we look at how we can break business models down, deconstruct them, and then reconstruct them as we test them. The second is the business model Navigator, which provides a range of different business models that you can apply to your business and enables you to really compare current business models with a broad range of existing ones. And then finally, we have freehand illustration of business models, and I'll share this with you. It's an approach that I find extremely valuable because it forces the entrepreneur, the innovator, to think about who all the stakeholders are and how they interrelate with one another with regard to the creation and exchange of value and consideration. We'll start with a look at the business model canvas. And as Alexander Osterwalder puts it, the canvas is a template that helps you document existing business models and develop new business models. And what it really is it's a visual chart that outlines elements that describe a firm's products or services across a broad range of different activities and elements. And here's what the business model canvas looks like. There are 9 elements in it, and I am going to review them as we go back to our initial 3 components of what a business model does. So we're going to break it down a little bit. So here's our familiar slide around the 3 elements, the 3 objectives that an effective business model does. And let's take a look at the business model canvas from the perspective of each of those. So first of all, we're going to take a look and see how a business model creates value for customers and what are the elements on the business model canvas that address that particular activity, how we create value for customers. Well, first of all, we certainly want to take a look at the customer segment. For whom are we creating value? Who are our most important customers or our most profitable customers? And what are the customer archetypes or personas? As we look at this, we identify specifically who our customer is, and we go out and we test which of those are the most important customers. Certainly, as we look at this, we also have to think about our customer relationships. How do we get our customers? Which customer relationships have we already established, and which new customer relationships do we wish to establish? What does it cost us to acquire that customer, and how valuable are those customers as well? And then the third area that we address with this first element is the value proposition, right? How do we create value for customers? Well, certainly we have to deliver that value proposition. What is the value that we deliver to our customers? Which one of our customers' problems are we really helping them to solve that they care the most about? Do we bundle some of our solutions as well? All elements that we look to address. Second, how do we deliver value to customers? And the business model canvas helps us in this regard as well. In the business model canvas, we ask these questions. What are the channels that we use to deliver value to customers? How do other, and we take a look not just at ours, but how do other companies or competitors reach customers as well? Which ones are the most cost efficient? Which ones work best? A range of questions that we investigate on our business model around channels. We also want to take a look at, when we take a look at how we deliver value, what are the key resources that we need to employ to make that happen? What are the key activities that we need to undertake to deliver that value? And who are our key partners? So in this element, when we evaluate business models and say, how do we deliver value to our customers? Channels, resources, activities, and partners are all elements as to how we deliver that value. Now let's get to that third element. And that third element is how we capture value for the organization. And in that, we take a look at two key areas. How do we develop the best possible revenue streams? And how do we manage our cost structure most effectively? Because when we talk about capturing value for our organization, those elements, as influenced by some of the other elements, of course, on the canvas, are crucial to ensuring that the revenues that we gain from that customer are greater than the cost that we have in order to acquire and service the customer. So this is the Osterwalder business model canvas, and it's a very useful tool when you take a look at the broad spectrum of your product offering and the competitive environment that you operate in to say which is working and what's not working, and how do we take that out to the marketplace and start to test each of these different elements. And this particular version of the tool has in it many of the questions that you want to ask, which really represent assumptions about your existing or your potential business model. Another approach to evaluating business models is called the Business Model Navigator, and it was presented in a book in 2014 by Oliver Gassman and several of his colleagues. This is a really different approach than we saw with the business model canvas, in that what Gassman does is identify 55 different types of business models, and he posits that they represent more than 90% of the profitable businesses in play, at least at the time of writing, and that businesses of many different types can be categorized under these umbrellas, and you'll get a better sense of that in just a minute. Now, the framework that he uses is somewhat of a simpler framework, and we'll take a look at that right now. And again, this is another way to identify different business models that you may or may not be aligned with, or different ways that you might innovate current or new models. So this is the framework that Gassman suggests. And if we think about this, it aligns quite closely with our three key elements of what a business model does. If we think about the who in the center, obviously, that's your customer. And then we say, how do you create value for customers? How do you deliver value for customers? And how do you create value or retain value for your organization? So a simpler structure from the way, or a diagram from the way it's presented, than we saw with Osterwalder. Useful, and what Gassman really focuses on is that you need to innovate at least 2 out of those 3 corners of the triangle. But what I find particularly interesting about this approach are the 55 different models that are presented. And here are, what do we have? A dozen models that out of the 55, and I'll give you some examples on each of them so that we can get a sense as to the different approaches that we might take or the different kinds of categories that we might look at. So if we look at the first, it's called an add-on business model, and an example of that would be Ryanair. And the approach that an add-on business model takes is that the core offering is relatively inexpensive. But if you want additional features, additional services, you're going to pay a lot for that. So if you think about Ryanair, the base fare, airfare, may be quite modest, but luggage, meals, anything else can quickly increase the price that you would pay for that ticket, or at least for that trip. Second model that we're looking at is crowdfunding. And a good example of crowdfunding is Indiegogo or Kickstarter, which may be a little more popular, a little better known, but Indiegogo was actually the first major crowdfunding site, and I take a lot of pride in that because it came out of the Haas School of Business in UC Berkeley. Of course, with crowdfunding, an entrepreneur puts forward a product, typically represented in a video, and asks potential customers or investors, but it's being used particularly now for customers, to agree to either buy or invest a certain amount of money. And once they hit a certain threshold, then the project is greenlit. And the obligations on both sides of that transaction, both of those that committed money and also the individual who's providing a product or service, are triggered, and everybody agrees to then consummate that transaction. A third business model is called crowdsourcing. Now, if you think about crowdsourcing, a great example of this is 99 Designs, which you may have used. And 99 Designs is where someone who is seeking a design, a logo, let's say, or an illustration, goes to the website, puts their request out there, and designers around the world will come back and say, I can deliver that design for X amount of money, or here are some thoughts on it. So as opposed to just having 1 or 2 people thinking about that, all of a sudden you have a crowd of experts, globally or locally, providing their input into a solution. Opens up all sorts of opportunities. The next business model we'd like to investigate is direct selling. And an example of this is the European toolmaker Hilti. So as opposed to going through traditional retailers, Hilti goes direct to the end consumer and has created, if we think about channels and infrastructures and partners, the right infrastructure to be able to capture that excess value themselves, which they then reinvest back into the way that they sell and support their products. The fifth out of our business model examples is franchising. And an easy example of that is McDonald's, that American hamburger chain that started out as a single chain, and as it grew, it owns its own stores, but it also provides a franchise to people who are willing to buy in to open up McDonald's under that brand name. And there's a lot of other things that come with franchising, which includes operating manuals and best practices, sometimes supply chains as well, that make those franchises more likely to be successful. It's one of the reasons why, of course, people pay for them. Next up on our list of business models is freemium. And a good example of freemium is Dropbox or Spotify, where you get a certain amount of service for free. But if you want more, you have to pay for it. It's a way to quickly expand your business because people will try it for free, and then as they like it, as they find value in it, they'll pay for that value. Next up is licensing, and an example that I'd like to quote here is Dolby Labs, which is the San Francisco Bay Area sound quality and audio quality company that has created a number of new technologies to improve audio quality. And as opposed to manufacturing their own equipment, what they do is they license those rights to stereo manufacturers and other audio component providers who then incorporate the Dolby technology in the equipment and pay a licensing fee back to Dolby. It can be a very efficient way to generate revenues, but the value that you deliver has to be very clear, and typically that intellectual property needs to be protected, and it is in the case of Dolby. Next up is mass customization. Now, mass customization is interesting because here you're selling thousands or millions of products, but each one is customized. What's a good example of that? How about Dell computers? In fact, Dell's unique value proposition is that it quickly creates customized computers for everybody who orders it and delivers them within just a few days. Everybody gets exactly the features that they want. Next up is the pay-per-use business model. What's an example of that? Well, an example I'm thinking of is something that many of us do every week, and that is we will buy a movie on our current cable or satellite TV provider or online and pay for the right to watch that movie just that once. Next up is the razor and blades strategy. Now, we know the razor and blades traditionally, which is the razors were sold inexpensively and the blades were sold more expensively. But of course, it's not just for razors and blades. One of the examples, and we referenced it earlier, is Nespresso, where Nestle makes less money than they might ordinarily on the coffee makers, but makes a lot of money on those Nespresso coffee pods and creates that subscription service. Two more. One of them is rent instead of buy. And in this instance, let's take a look at the car business. We've talked about transportation a number of times. And instead of buying a car, increasingly we're seeing franchises, we're seeing new businesses such as Zipcar or Car2Go or others where you're able to rent just the amount of car that you need. And it's not even the car by the day. You might just rent the car by the hour or by 2 hours or by a certain distance. Those business models are evolving as technology is making it easier and easier for us to enable those transactions and track cars, users, and payments. And finally, the last of the 12 that I wanted to highlight here is the subscription business model. And a great example of that is Netflix, which has recently expanded now into hundreds of countries. And as opposed to renting by the movie, you subscribe to Netflix, and all of the content that Netflix offers on whatever subscription level you have is available to you. So these are just a number of examples that we wanted to focus on within the 55 that are available in the Business Model Navigator book and model. When we come back, we'll look at freehand illustration. The third approach that we'll review around how to document your business model is to create a thorough diagram of the key players, the key stakeholders, our participants in the delivery, the creation and delivery of your product or service across your ecosystem. And this is an approach that I've been using since long before Osterwalder created the business model canvas or Gassman and his colleagues created the business model navigator. And this is to really just freehand draw the stakeholders and the flows of consideration, the flows of value between them. And by that I mean not just flows of money, but also flows of other value. It could be data, it could be goods and services, it could be referrals. There's a host of different elements of value that exist in an ecosystem far beyond cash. Let's take a look at an example or two, shall we? The first one, I'm going to take a look at two. We'll look at Netflix and we'll look at Google. The first one that I'd like to share with you is Google. And you can see my rough diagram of the basic Google ecosystem when it comes to the way that Google generates revenues when you, as an individual, conduct a search. Think about this. Every time that we conduct a search on Google, Google does something with that information to generate cash. In fact, Google has created perhaps the most efficient cash-generating machine, perhaps in the history of business, given how they turn a search into money every time we do it. And the great thing about it is they provide us with a lot of utility, a lot of value as well. Let's take a look and see how this works. So here you are, I'm going to go ahead and draw on this, as the user conducting a search. And what do? You provide Google with your search terms. So you provide Google with data or with information. And what does Google do with that data? It uses its search algorithms and it provides you back with search results. So you have results that are valuable to you, and you have a great transaction in that regard. It didn't cost you anything, and you continue to use Google to provide data and receive results. But what does Google do with that data? Google provides that data in one way or another to an advertiser. And the advertiser values that because they have either now, as a result of this transaction, gotten an impression from you, the user, on their product or service, or perhaps you've clicked through on an advertisement on a link that Google has provided, or something similar. So what does the advertiser do with that? Well, they go ahead and pay Google money for that. That's a simplified version of what the Google business model looks like, but we can see how it's very effective and how it iterates consistently on both sides, with Google right in the middle of this extremely valuable exchange of information. Let's take a look at another example, and we'll look at Netflix. And here we have a slightly more complicated ecosystem. So Netflix is in the middle, and Netflix provides content to consumers. And it doesn't provide content through cable networks. It provides what's called over-the-top content, or it provides it directly to consumers, but it needs to use a data network, either a mobile data network or an internet service provider. So we have the consumer, or the consumer of content, Netflix, and a data network, but then Netflix also needs to have that content to provide. Now, at the beginning, let's take a look here. Netflix would pay the studios money and receive in exchange content, TV shows, movies, other content that it would then share with its users. Then Netflix evolved and started creating its own content. It started contracting with its own producers, and the exchange was roughly the same. Netflix would provide money to the producers, and the producers would provide content back to Netflix. So now Netflix has third-party content and original content that it can push out to its subscribers. But it doesn't push it out directly to its subscribers because the data has to travel over a network. So Netflix then will send the content to the consumers through a data network. So we have content or data going to the data networks and then going on down to the consumer. So the consumer receives that content. Now, what does the consumer do? Well, the consumer pays a subscription. So the consumer will then pay Netflix money every month for the right to receive that content. And it also pays the data networks money for that channel, that data tube that the data arrives at. Now, one other thing that typically happens is that Netflix sometimes may underwrite the cost of data to the data networks. So Netflix may spend a little bit of money as well to subsidize that transmission to the data networks. So here we have an example of a Netflix model with a lot of exchanges of consideration, content, data, yet it all adds up in a way that Netflix has an extremely profitable business model as well. I have two tests before we end this mini segment. I have two tests that I suggest that you ask yourself every time you think about a business model. It's the narrative test and the numbers test. First of all, can you explain your business model in a way that somebody listening to it that isn't familiar with it understands. That's the narrative test. Tell your spouse, tell your parents about, try and explain your business model and see if they get it. And number 2 is the numbers test. At the end of the day, do the numbers add up? Do your revenues eventually, maybe not when you're starting up, but eventually exceed your costs? Now, both of these tests sometimes run into challenges with brand new business models, and if we take a look at some of the digital business models disrupting analog with some of these digital business models, because companies will come up with services and they won't charge anything for those services. People are getting value. Eventually, those new digital companies will need to find a way to extract money from some of the players in that ecosystem in order to create a sustainable business model. So always apply those 2 tests before you get too far. We have frameworks and tools that help us diagram, illustrate, and capture business models and start to innovate them. How do we put that all to work? That's what we'll be focusing on here. Before we move on to customer discovery, however, let's take a look and create a real-time example of a business opportunity that we're presented with and the different types of business models that we might employ. That's the first exercise that we'll undertake here in this category. And in fact, this particular exercise deals with cows. What I'd like you to do would be to think about the different types of business models that you can come up with to monetize a cow or a herd of cows. Now, some of them are somewhat obvious, right? If we take a look at a few of the more obvious ones, we'll include things such as beef production or milk production or leather production. But beyond those, there are a lot of other ways that you might be able to monetize a cow. And I want you to go ahead and pause your recording right now for 3 minutes. Give yourself 3 minutes, and I'd like you to be as creative as possible and think about what are the things that you might be able to do to create a business, humorous, serious, or otherwise, around cows. Ready? Go ahead and pause your computer. Take 3 minutes right now. Okay, so we're back. You paused your computer. You've got your list. And again, I'm about to move on to some of the examples that I might think of. So if you're not ready, take a moment. All right. Here's some examples beyond the 3 that I mentioned already that I might think of as different ways to monetize a cow. In addition to beef, milk, and leather, you might offer cow rides. You might go into the business of cows as pets. How about cow art? Perhaps setting up exhibitions either of cows as art or perhaps allow people to paint cows. What if you wanted to rent a cow for the weekend, for the day, for the hour? How about using cows to help manage people's lawns? As opposed to a gardening service, you'd bring in a few cows and they would go ahead and crop that lawn nice and low. Or perhaps weed control. We've seen that in goats and sheep. Why not do it with cows? Another thing about cows is that while they may eat a lot of grass and feed, well, they also create a bit of a mess, and that mess can be used to create methane gas. So perhaps you go into the business of being an energy producer. Another one, why not think about using cows as watch cows, kind of like watch dogs, but they're bigger and they'd moo if there was an intruder. Maybe have a number of cows that had cowbells of different sizes, and you could train them to play songs in a cowbell orchestra. Or cow racing, kind of like horse racing, but with cows. Maybe we do shared cow ownership. I get 1/10 of a cow, as do 9 others that decide to invest in cows, or I get a cow for a month a year. We could do cow petting or cow tipping. I don't know if you know anything about cow tipping, but you sneak into a pasture at night while the cows are sleeping and you try and tip them over. That's kind of a college prank. There are plenty of things that you can do with cows to think about how you might monetize those cows. Now, we have a number of ideas attached to them, but what are the business models that we might then utilize for these various types of ideas? Well, traditionally we would have cow ownership, but perhaps we could think about crowdfunding cows. In other words, we will agree that once we raise X amount of money across all of us, we'll go ahead and buy a cow, and then we can share whatever benefits come from it. What about a freemium model for cows? Let's say we did cow rides. The first cow ride is free, but you have to pay for every cow ride after that. Or pay per use, the version of the freemium model there. Or direct sales. When we set up an Amazon for cows and offer cows directly to anybody who wants them. We could set up subscription models. Or think of cow as a service. Instead of owning a cow, let's offer people to rent a cow, or think of cow as a service to do whatever it is that we want. We might have a sponsorship model. People who sell cow-based products might want to sponsor a cow and then let you use that cow for a period of time. We could have fractional ownership, and perhaps that's a little related to the crowdfunding that we mentioned earlier. Or a franchise. And that is, there's a special way to own cows, and I'm going to franchise that to individuals. Or, let's use that razor and blades model. In other words, I'm going to sell you the cows inexpensively, but the feed, the upkeep, and all the other things you need to maintain a happy cow, I'm going to charge a lot of money for. Perhaps we want to create a cow marketplace. For people who get tired of their cows, or they want different colored cows, they can barter, or they can buy and sell cows from one another. And we're the middleman. We're the eBay of cows. Maybe we even think about a cow-based currency to create a different form of exchange. Now, some of these may seem a little bit silly, but as we're thinking about business models, let's go back to that list of business models of companies that are fundamentally disrupting existing businesses. And let's apply some of those business models that I've just mentioned. Airbnb is creating a new type of marketplace between buyers and sellers. Uber, transportation as a service, a different way of thinking about taxis or car ownership. Dropbox, a freemium model, start out free and then pay as you use more. Amazon direct sales. The Dollar Shave Club, well, that's the razors and blades model, but it's also a subscription service. Tesla, by eliminating the dealers, they're going direct. Of course, they're also innovating dramatically through other types of technology. Spotify, music as a service as opposed to owning it, and also a freemium model. And Bitcoin, well, we talked about a cow-based currency, but what's the Bitcoin currency based on with blockchain? Something else altogether, a different unit of value. So while we can have some fun with our cows, and we think about how those different business models might be employed in developing cow-based businesses, we can also bring that forward and say we can apply these types of business models to really almost any type of product or service, at least in differing types. So what we're going to do when we return is we're going to say, how do we test which of these business models work best in different types of markets, with different types of products, and with different types of customers. Here comes the next important question, and that is, with all of these different potential business models, how do we test those alternatives and arrive at the best approach and the best business model that we can determine to take our new business to market, to create the most sustainable business opportunity? Well, to do that, we're going to turn to some of the work done by my UC Berkeley colleague, Steve Blank. And Steve developed the customer discovery process. It's part of a bigger process called customer discovery and development that he memorialized in his really groundbreaking book in 2012 called The Startup Owner's Manual. And there are 4 steps to the customer discovery process, this initial phase of discovery around the business model and that right fit. We're going to go through all 4 of them now with some specific examples. So in the first phase, we state our hypothesis around the business model. So we're going to approach this with an assumption that one of the business models is the one that we believe, our hunch, our assumption, is the right one for us to go to market with. Now, what's a good way to state that assumption? Well, let's go back to our business model canvas with Alexander Osterwalder and say, let's put our assumptions in place about what this business might look like. What are the customer segments, channels, the relationships we have, how we deliver value? All of those elements, including, of course, our cost structure and revenue streams. So if we look at the business model canvas and we start to do that, then we say, what comes next? We've put our hypotheses out there. And the next thing we want to do is let's test to make sure that at the very least, we are solving the right problem. So we go out and we start talking to customers, and we do that because everything that we've laid out so far on the business model canvas is an assumption. It's an assumption about the problem, it's an assumption about the customer segments, it's an assumption about how we'll develop those relationships, and how much we'll be able to charge for that as well. So we begin by going out and talking in particular in this first phase to our customers and our customer segments. Let's understand the problem that they're solving, or let's put it another way, is the problem that we believe that we are addressing with our solution the same challenge or the same problem that we hear from our customers. And as opposed to asking them closed-ended solutions, for example, do you have this problem? We want to ask open-ended solutions that are along the lines of what are the issues you're facing? How are you currently solving them? How might you be interested in solving them? And what are some of the alternatives you are seeking? So we'll go out and we'll test the problem. The next thing that we'll do, once we've at least validated that a problem exists, is that we'll go out and we'll start to test the solution. So we validated the problem in phase 2. In phase 3, we'll start to provide some alternatives that we can get feedback from those potential customers. And how do we test a solution when we actually haven't built the product yet? Well, the way we test that solution is with what's called a minimum viable product, an MVP. And one of the important things to keep in mind when you introduce a minimum viable product is it is exactly what the MVP, what the acronym stands for, and that is make it as basic as possible, but with enough features, enough elements around it to get across the core value proposition of the solution that you are suggesting. And there are a number of ways that we can do that. So some of the ways that we might look to do that include sharing a prototype or a mock-up of a physical product or a digital product, talking about a use case, doing a demo or even a semi-realistic demo, or providing a video of how it might solve a problem. If it's a digital product, you might mock up a website and ask users to interact with the website, even if the entire back end may not be in place. What we want to do is to get a sense as to, is the solution that we're suggesting, that we have hypothesized, is it one that is of interest and engaging to our potential customers? So when we do this, we're going to be taking a look at a number of these elements from a solution standpoint. What's the value proposition? Perhaps What are the channels that we want to use to deliver this product in? We might investigate partners or resources that would be needed, or key activities to ensure that our assumptions around those are accurate. So these are all elements that we will test during this phase 3 of our customer discovery process. Next, we move on to phase 4. And phase 4 is where we pause and we assess what have we learned so far. We've outlined our hypotheses. We've validated, hopefully, the problem. We have tested and validated the solution. And based on all of that, our next question before we move on is, do we have a solution that we want to then take to the next stage, or do we need to revisit some of our hypotheses and go back and pivot or iterate on our solution and come up with something a little bit different? And for that, we go back to the business model canvas and we look across all of these different attributes, the 9 elements of the business model canvas, to ensure that we are able to validate all of those. And if not, we continue with this iterative process until at least we believe that we have general validation across all 9 of those elements. And once we have that validation, once we've either validated or pivoted or a combination of both, we then move on to the next stage, which is where we talk about customer validation. Now that's going to go beyond what we'll cover in this class session, but customer validation is when we start looking at the size of target markets, how scalable they are, developing our go-to-market strategy and plan as we begin the commercialization process itself. Let's take all the work that we've done during this class session and roll it into a quick case study to wrap things up. So we are going to go out and take our cow-based business through the customer discovery process, business and business model both. Let's take a look at how we do that. First of all, let's focus this case study a little bit. So my assumption, my approach is that there is a need, there is an opportunity for a different approach to mowing people's lawns, to maintaining people's lawns by grazing cows. And the business model that I would like to adopt and I would like to test is a subscription business model. So don't pay me for every time I show up. Just pay me a certain amount to maintain a healthy lawn, and a lawn that is well cropped, or in our case, well grazed. And the way we'll go out and test all of these and determine whether we choose to move on with launching the business is the customer discovery process. So first, we'll approach phase 1, and we'll document our key assumptions across the 9 steps or the 9 elements of the business model canvas. So to start with, who's our customer segment? Well, we've decided to focus on homeowners who have a lawn and currently either maintain it themselves or pay others to maintain it, that might be interested in an alternative, and perhaps they might be interested in a more environmental alternative. So we'll go ahead and build a persona around that. We'll also start to lay out how we get those customers. Do we market to them door to door? Do we market to them perhaps at farmers markets where they may be more likely to attend? We'll start to develop that. That includes our channel approach as well. How do we deliver the process? Do we do it directly? Or do we have others that maybe will franchise our cow lawn grazing service too? So we'll create some hypotheses around the channel. Next, of course, we'll determine what's that right value proposition. As I shared earlier, our hypothesis is we're going to start with a subscription at a certain rate instead of perhaps the current amount that they are paying other people. So it's a subscription-based model. And we'll determine the other elements or we'll lay out the other elements under that value proposition. What are the key activities that we need to undertake to move cows around and to get them to graze? And what are some of the key resources that we need? Well, cows certainly being one of them, and perhaps a large trailer with a truck to pull it as well, unless all of the homes are very near one another and we can just walk our cow around. And finally, what kind of partners do we need? One of them may be, we don't want to own the cows, we'll actually partner with people who own cows. And in fact, when we look at revenue streams, we may have just opened up a second revenue stream. The first revenue stream would be homeowners who will pay us to have cows keep their lawn nicely grazed. But the second revenue stream may be cow owners who would be interested in having us feed their cows and would pay us something for that. Of course, we'll feed them by taking them from home to graze the lawn. And then we'll have to look at our cost structure to manage all of that. All of these elements of our overall business are laid out like that on the business model canvas. Now, once we've done that, we move on to phase 2, which is let's test the problem. In other words, we've laid out a set of assumptions that this problem exists. Let's make sure that we actually have potential customers that are interested in this problem, that have this problem and are seeking a solution. So that's what we're going to focus on. So we'll go out and we'll talk to many customers. This is where we get out of the building and we speak to homeowners in their homes, in farmers markets, in web forums, wherever we can to understand who is facing this challenge and start to get some idea about how they might approach a solution. And then we move on to our next stage, phase 3, where we actually test the solution. And this is where we'll try and test it with that minimum viable product. So one option may be to identify a friend or a colleague or a farmer who has a cow and find 3 or 4 customers who are actually willing to sign up for $100 a month for us to maintain their lawns with cows, and we'll sign them up for the first month. And we'll go out and we'll test that solution and have our cow graze their lawn every week for a month and see how they like the solution, if our assumptions around costs and transportation and everything else are accurate, or where they're not, which ones we have to change. And then we'll move on to phase 4, where we go back to our business model canvas. We look at our original assumptions and we say, are these the right customers? Are our cost assumptions correct? Are they willing to sign up for a second month? We'll have a great test when we say, can we come back next month and will you give us another $100 to manage your lawn? And we'll go on from there. Now, if our test is successful, we then will look to move on and start to say, what's our plan to commercialize this more broadly? Move on from discovery into development. If not, we may choose to pivot, to focus on a different market. Perhaps it would be on an industrial or a municipal market instead of a homeowner. Or perhaps instead of cows, we decide goats might be a better option, but our core business proposition is accurate. Anyway, that's a way to think about it, and you can take almost any product or service through a similar type of iterative process in this early customer discovery approach to test the business concept and to test the business model. Now, there are some great resources, and I've referenced them through this session. There's Alexander Osterwalder's book on business models. There's Gassman, Frankenberger, and Sis's book on the business model Navigator. We have Steve Blank on customer discovery and the startup owner's manual. And then we have Eric Ries, who really captured a lot of this in his classic book, The Lean Startup. I hope you've enjoyed the session. See you soon.
My name is Andrew Isaacs. I'm the faculty director for this program. And I'd like to share a couple of ideas and thoughts, things for you to look for in this video that follows before we actually start. The concepts around financing your startup that are presented by Professor Nauta in the video that follows are really your best friend in terms of getting financing for the startup that aligns with the needs that you have as an entrepreneur and an innovator. The triangular-shaped ramp diagram that Professor Nauta diagrams on the board is absolutely your best friend in organizing your thoughts about financing your venture. What do I mean by that? He's organized the sources for venture finance in a sequence that orders those sources in a rather organized way, with high risk to you at one end of the spectrum, high risk to the other party at the other end of the spectrum, but also informs your thinking, I hope informs your thinking, not only about the risk allocation in accepting a particular type of financing, but also the chances of success. There's a strong correlation between transferring the risk of financing to other parties and the likelihood of success for your venture. Now that seems a little counterintuitive, but actually it makes a lot of sense, because people investing in other people are much more careful with their money than they are if they're investing in themselves. And especially for institutional venture capitalists who are investing other people's money in your venture, they're doubly cautious, because they're investing in you, not themselves, and they're investing other people's money. They have a fiduciary responsibility as venture capitalists to those limited partners whose money it actually is. Pay close attention to that ramp-shaped diagram, and everything else falls into place. I hope you enjoy the lesson that follows.
Hi, my name is Frans Nauta, and I teach here at the Haas School of Business, Innovation and Entrepreneurship. And in Europe, I work with EIT Climate Kick in their startup program. In the next 20 minutes, I'm going to talk about sources of funding for your startup. Now, what is a startup? A startup is, here we go, a temporary organization to search for a repeatable and scalable business model. So we don't want to stay a startup. It's temporary. We want to build something big because we want something repeatable and scalable on the business side. So the goal of a startup is, here it comes, total global domination in your chosen market niche. You want to do something big. You don't want to do something small. No, you want to have, as Steve Jobs calls it, you want to make a dent in the universe. That's what startups are about. That's why they are so cool. But you don't have a business model yet, like these large companies that you are looking at to build. So you probably need funding to get off the ground, to pay for your search phase, and also to pay for your scale-up phase, where you're going to build this repeatable and scalable organization. So before I start about what sources of funding are available, why don't you start yourself? And just take a minute, write down as many sources of funding that you can come up with for your startup. And if you are in the room with someone, you might want to compare notes and just discuss for a little bit what you know about funding already. So go ahead and write down the sources of funding that you already know. All right. Well, I don't know how many you have, but I have 12, and they're here on the board. So this is our matrix. Up here it says harder to get. So the higher I am up there, the harder it is to get. And of course that comes with less risk. So the chance of success increases the further we get down there. So let's start in the most risky phase and easy to get money. So what would that be? Well, that would be me. If I do a startup, I can put my own money in. And that money can be anything. It can be your savings. It can be that you have a job that you sort of part-time keep, and then use the free time that you get to put that time in your startup. And you can also For instance, take a second mortgage. Actually, I did all three of them when I did a startup. The mortgage part, I'm not so sure whether I would do that again, but at the time, I was young, as they say. The benefit, of course, is here, this is my money. I'm fully in control. There's nobody that I have to report to and say what I did with their money. The company's all mine, so if I'm a success here, the money's all mine, the benefit is all mine. But the downside, of course, is if things go wrong, it's me that bleeds. There's no one else involved. So, And also, if you want to build a big company, you're probably going to spend at least $1 million in investment, and probably a little more. So I'm not going to do that on my own, unless you already have all that money in the bank. But then you're probably not watching this video because you already did a startup. And this program is typically for people who do a first round of their startup. So we're going to look at other sources of funding. Now, you may have heard of this family, friends, and fools. And let's start with family. Well, it can be easy, right? Because your family loves you, so they root for you and they want to support you. But there's a downside here, of course, because as most founders that I know, they're really convincing people. They are really enthusiastic about what they do. And your family has a hard time saying no to you because they love you. So you might pull them into something that they're actually not really convinced about, simply because they feel obliged to. And then there's the other thing. If you take their money, let's say you have an uncle, and he's really enthusiastic about your startup, and he's doing really well in business. So he has enough money in the bank, and he gives you 30,000 euros, dollars, doesn't matter, a lot of money. And all looks good. But then, unfortunately, his wife gets sick, and she dies, and he loses his job because he gets depressed, and he has to sell the house because he can't afford it anymore. And a year from now, you're sitting at Christmas dinner, and he's sitting across from you, and he could really, really use the 30,000 that he put in your company. Actually, there's nothing he would like more to have that money back. But the company just went belly up. The company went broke. It failed. So you wasted his money, and he's in a horrible situation. Now, you think you will have a nice conversation during Christmas dinner? I don't think so. So we prefer not to take family money. Don't. Because you can't get new family. You can't get new friends. So let's look at friends. Same sort of story. They root for you. They want you to be successful. And they also might think, well, my friend is so smart. He might be the next Zuckerberg. So if I put in a little money, I might get really, really rich. And I'll be part of his adventure anyway. So people put in money into your company. Now, all kinds of horrible things can happen. You waste their money. The company goes belly up. Some of your friends say, I know you learned so much. Let me invest in your next company. But some will be really angry with you. Well, the good thing is, you can get new friends. Big difference with family. Next is what we call the dentist, or the fool. And the dentist is typically someone that has enough money in the bank to invest in you $30,000, $50,000, euros, doesn't matter. Because they have it in the bank, because they already have a house, they have cars, maybe have a boat, and they just have the money. And typically these are senior people, sort of end career, 50s, maybe 60s, and there's not much inspiration in their professional practice. They just do their work, they're really good at it, they enjoy it, but there's not much excitement in it because they've been doing it for such a long time. So they might think, well, it could be really fun to invest in this young guy or girl who's going to be really the next Zuckerberg. Wouldn't that be great? Oh, and I would also make money. You know, the old term for venture capital was adventure capital. So these people are looking for adventures, and you are sort of their ticket. And it can be a useful investment for them as well. But it comes with a downside, because typically they don't know your business. And the consequence of that is that because they are an investor, they want to be informed by you. But you have to sort of completely learn them how your market works. And then the other thing that will happen, because these typically are smart people, they were successful, right? They've got enough money to invest in your company. So these are successful people. They will give you free advice, but they don't know your business. So the question is whether that is useful advice. So you might waste a lot of money taking investments from people who don't understand what you're doing. So we call this dumb money. And typically, you prefer smart money. We'll get to that a little later.